So a log staircase. I've got a cottage up north, and this is sort of like what I do on my summer vacation from school or from work. So it was a log staircase is what we wanted. We went through a number of designs and sort of settled on this guy is the final result, which involves a bunch of half logs, pine, 3 feet wide, roughly 12 inches wide by 3 feet long. They're cut into the rails, so you see that there are two 3-inch by 8-inch rails that go up to the top deck, and the logs are cut in so that they sit on the rail. So the plan is we wanted pine stairs, half logs on large rails. It'll take about 16 half logs, 12 inches by 36 inches, and two 3 by 8-inch pine rails, 14 feet long, to do the job. The logs and the rails were cut at a local sawmill. Fortunately, there's one just up around from me, so he could cut the pine right there. He'd pick out the pine we wanted, so I knew what I needed from 12 inch, roughly 12 inches wide, or in diameter. So he cut them up for us, and we hauled them back to the cottage. The rails were stored inside the cottage to dry. The half logs, I put them under the cottage because I had a lot of them. So I set them up and said they would dry under there. That was my first mistake. There's not enough airflow underneath the cottage. So there's a lot of moisture, and so they started to spalt and have a little bit of mildew on them. So we discovered the next spring when I went down there to take a look and see how they were doing, because we'd stripped the bark off of them, obviously, right away, so we didn't have any bug infestations in that. So it was first stripped and then put underneath the cottage. Went down into the cottage and said, oh well. So we had to move them out, so they got moved back upstairs into the cottage, into a drier environment and a little bit more airflow and a little bit more heat. And the whole rail and logs sat there for 2 years, just to let them dry out a little bit and to stabilize, because they were just fresh cut from the mill. So the first step was to build the rails to get them in place. Yeah, it's all pine. Yeah, all white pine, local white pine up in Quebec. The rails didn't twist very much. I just needed to lightly sand them. I didn't want to run them through and make them nice and smooth and glossy. I wanted to show the saw marks on them and really keep that detail to being rustic as opposed to something that was milled. The top of the rails I left flat, so the nice square corners, because I needed them to join in properly with the log rails. The bottoms of the rail I rounded with a 1-inch rounding bit, because chances are I will run underneath the stairs too close, and I'll rather have a nice little bump rather than a big nasty cut. So they're rounded underneath. I installed the stair rails to confirm the angle. A traditional angle for stairs is 35 degrees. That's what most of us have in our homes. We tried it at 35, and I just didn't have enough landing area at the bottom. It was too close to the front door, and it would have made it very difficult to get in and out. So I needed to adjust it slightly. So I pushed it to 40 degrees. Which is not ideal. 35 is the best, but 40 was okay. And it's a cottage, so I'm not having massive traffic up and down. So they were installed at 40 degrees and set up. The logs themselves, well, they've dried for a couple of years, so they're warped, they're twisted, they're varying width, depth-wise. They're not all nice, perfect logs, and they're mostly round. And so now I have to flatten the top of that step. So the tool of choice is a radial arm saw. And we talked earlier about why do you use a saw? Why do you pick a specific saw for a specific reason? A radial arm saw is absolutely perfect for this application, because it will give me a straight edge or a flat top all the way across. When I draw that arm across on a radial arm saw, you're guaranteed that blade is not going to go down. It shouldn't go funny on you if you've leveled it properly. So if your bottom surface is absolutely plumb, that saw blade will move back and forth and be absolutely plumb. And that was the key reason why this saw was so important, because without it I couldn't do it. I could hand plane it and do a lot of things. I wasn't going to put it on a jointer because it's not wide enough to handle 12 inches. This is the only way I could flatten it out. Right? The other method might have been a router with a bed and setting up the log, but this is the tool I had, and this is why I needed to do it this way. The jig was a simple jig. Piece of plywood, 2 pieces of plywood, one on each end of the log, 7 inches high, because that matched the height I needed, and about 12 inches long, which was the width of the log. So you sat down there with the 7 inches high piece, you put the log on top, and you screwed it in. And now when I run that blade across, that top and the part is all going to disappear, because the dado blade and the saw is going to take it away. And it's you draw it across, push it back, move it over. Draw it across, push it back, move it over. Okay, so it's 3 feet long, 3/4 inch dado blade, cutting out a 1/2 inch at a time, a lot of times. We timed it. We did 1 log. After we got good at it, took about 9 minutes to do a log with 2 guys. And just knowing what the process was, you got the process. So what's the process? So you turn the log upside down, and you can see it's crooked. On the one edge is higher than the other edge, and likewise on the other side. This thing is going to twist. It's natural. So you figure out some shims. How thick do I need to make the shims in order to make this flat? And you use that shimming method. So now if I look at that log, that would be flat. Okay? If I took that and drew a line across the top of that wood, that would be flat. So now you put a piece of plywood right on top of that little strip and screw it to the wood. And now you've got your reference point. Okay? Now I don't have a picture. This is the other side, so it was a little different. It only needed one shim rather than the little extra ones because of height. So I didn't take a picture of the template after it was put on. But it goes like this. There's the log in elegant twisting. You put a shim in place that's high enough to take out any shim, any exposed area that's going there. You have to be just slightly higher. Drop your plywood down on top of the shim, make sure it's firm and solid, screw it in. Now it's fixed. Now if I take that and turn that upside down, all the way around, on its back, I've got a perfect plane right there.
Chris, did you have any variants with the logs twisting at all where they didn't fit in the jig?
No. And I didn't really care too much. There were some of the logs you'll see in some of the pictures at the ends, the guy just cut them with a chainsaw, right? So he's not deadpan accurate. It's going to be twisted out like this and twisted out. But I really didn't care too much. You know, if it was really bad, I sort of compensated for it. But for the most part, it didn't really bother me. As long as those 2 pieces of plywood were the same, and I knew that radial arm saw was going to skirt right across it, and that was one of the things, is to make sure it skirts across. So the radial arm saw won't work in the normal configuration because I need 7 inches of height right off the bat in order to do the radial arm saw. So I had to turn the damn thing around. So I took the center, which would normally this is facing the other way. The normal bed for radial arm saw is back in that towards the back of the saw where the wood is, right? So I had to turn the headstock all the way around and face it out because I needed depth down to my base station in order to make this thing work. That was the only way to do it, was to get enough height for the log. So I turned it around. The big pieces of wood beside it were necessary to give it balance. When I turn it around and you pull the blade all the way out to the end, there's too much weight on the end of the blade, so it starts pressing on the plywood and starts leaning forward. Well, I'm not going to get a flat cut if I do that. So I needed to put some strengtheners beside it, so that's screwed up from underneath to give that plywood more support, right? So it doesn't fall forward when I pull the full weight of the unit out, right, on the end of it. Whereas normally, if it's the other way around, it's supported by the mechanism, by the cabinetry itself, right? So I had to make many adjustments on this to make sure it was deadpan flat, so that I knew that blade going across there was going to be perfect when I put the woods in place. So here's a piece of log with the plywood. Now you can see plywood attached, and if you take a look at it, the back is shallow and the front edge is high, and you'll see all that nice mold sitting on the side of the log that we talked about already on the first mistake. So you start plowing with the blade. So now you see that the back is getting higher. The front's about the same. This is look from above, 1/2 inch at a time. At the front of the saw, at the very front of the mechanism, I laid down a tape and I marked out 1/2 inch marks. So I had one guy at the saw blade pulling across and then pulling back. The second gentleman, my second brother-in-law, he was on the side and he would shift it forward by 1/2 inch on my mark. So we didn't have to worry about were you too far, were you too back. It was always 1/2 inch. And it would just zip, zip, creep, zip, zip, creep, zip, zip, creep. And you just go all the way through it. And those guys, that's all they did. I told them it was going to be lazy, boring work, but they thoroughly enjoyed it from that point of view because they could just go across. And you can see it's aligned with that plywood edge because that's the way it's supposed to be. It's perfectly flat. It's perfectly flat to the table, so I know I've got a good flat top and it's not wandering. So now you get further down that log, and guess what? The back end is high, front end is shallow, right? Because that's the way the log twisted. This is the last shot before the last piece was taken off, and that back end is high, that front end is just about at the smallest it can get, and that cleans it off. So the end result is I go from a nice piece of wood that's got a wobbly top to a nice flat face. And the only way I could have done it was with that tool because it was the right tool for the job. It was the only one that gave me a cutting surface that was level all the time across 12 inches of surface. And it was, fortunately, it was available for me, so I could use it. So now I need a second reference point. So I have one reference point that's flat. I need a second reference point to do all my other cuts because they all have to be square. So this was fairly simple. I took a video of it. Unfortunately, it was a little bit out of focus for some reason on the camera. But essentially, I looked at each edge